Okay, so we had hopefully you've had a chance to review the basics of the standard costing lecture. So let's take a look at a problem. All right, so we can kind of get into the nuts and bolts of uh, what we are uh, doing here. All right, so I've posted the handout. You can see in the content for today, and it's this right here. All right, so Duroff's company produces coats. Company uses a standard cost system and has set the following standards for materials and labor. All right, and so as is often the case with accounting, the important stuff is in parentheses. All right, so fabric, um, each coat uses 8 yards of fabric, and fabric costs $6 per yard. All right. As it relates to direct labor, uh, each coat takes 2 hours of labor to make, and labor costs $18 per hour. All right. So um, we see that there's just for direct materials and direct labor. We actually will deal with overhead later in the chapter, but for the time being, we'll ignore that. All right. So during the year, Duross produced 55,000 coats. Actual fabric purchase was 460,000 yards at $5.75 per yard. No beginning or ending inventories. Actual direct labor was 120,000 hours at 19 and a quarter per hour. All right. So again, we've done this before. We've got standards, which would have been before the year started, right? These are derivative of the budgetary process, the 8 yards, $6. So company expects to pay $6 per yard and expects to use 8 yards per coat and expects that each coat's going to take 2 hours to make and expects to pay a rate of $18, right? And then we've got actual information. So this is year-end information, right? Okay, so we'll start with A. Compute the cost of fabric and direct labor incurred that should be, and that's a big word, should be incurred for the production of 55,000 coats. So what the question's asking here is, based on the standard, what should have been the cost of 55,000 coats. All right. Now there's a direct way to do this. I'm going to go the long way first, just because information may not always be presented in this format, and then we'll use the direct way to answer part A. So I'll start over here. All right, let's blow this up just a little bit. Make it easier to see. All right, so we've got our formula sheet, and so this is one you'll want to spend some time with before the next exam. And really what we're asking is, let's see. So we have standard cost per unit, which actually doesn't get us to what the question's answering. So let's think through this. All right. Each coat makes, or I should say, takes 8 yards of fabric. That's costing $6 per yard, and 2 hours of direct labor. That's costing $18 per hour. All right. and the company's going to make 55,000 coats. All right. So that formula gets you, because all of this is standard information, or information from the budgetary standards. So that information gets you to the cost that should have been incurred to make 55,000, at least according to budgetary standards. All right. Okay, so when we run this formula, and actually let me set it up, make sure I don't get an order of operations error. Okay, so $4.62 million is what we get. That's the standard cost to manufacture 55,000 coats. All right. It is worth noting that if you see this presentation, that we don't have to go through this level of detail. Not every problem will present it like this, but we could have just as easily taken the $84 total standard cost, total prime cost per unit, times the 55,000 and gotten the same $4.62 million. All right. So that would have been the most direct way here. I did it the long way because we won't always have this presentation. All right. B. Compute total budget variances for materials and for labor. Okay. So here we're going to compare the actual amount spent for direct material, in this case fabric, with the amount spent on labor. I got things popping up, excuse me. Actual cost of direct materials. We bought 460,000 yards at $5.75. I'm getting that information from right here. All right. So direct materials actually cost $2.645 million. Standard cost should have been, well, $48 per unit. Or if we're not given the 48, we can think of that as $8 times or I should say 8 yards times the $6 times the 55,000 units. All right, so we have a budget variance for materials of $5,000. All right, and we can label this unfavorable because we spent more than the standard would indicate. All right. That's only half of what Part B asks for. It also asks for the budget variance for labor, so we can do that. All right, actual direct labor, 120,000 hours. $19.25 was the rate. $2.31 million, and then we'll compute the standard for 55,000 coats. All right, 1.98 million. Okay, we get 330,000. All right, this also unfavorable. All right. So, what do we know at this point? Well, we know that there's a variance that in both cases we spent more than the standard would indicate should have been spent. And can we explain why we spent more? Perhaps we can. The way this problem is presented, not all will be presented this way. But if we wanted to take corrective action, we may not have enough information to do so. All right. So we'll press on to the next part. All right. Part C. Materials price variance. All right. Now let's refer to our formula sheet. All right. And we do have a formula here that's going to be relevant for us. Materials price variance. Actual AP is actual price times actual quantity minus SP times AQ. All right. And that's the long form. We don't really need that. This is just showing you the algebraic equation that gets us here. So what we really need, actual price minus standard price times actual quantity. And that gets us to our materials price variance. All right. All right, so we're going to do actual price minus standard price times actual quantity. All right. So for this particular problem, we want to be, so the actual price of materials is $5.75. All right, we get that here. Now keep in mind that is a period end number. It's a number that we wouldn't have had until the end of the period. Standard price, $6. All right. Actual quantity, well, that's your 460,000 yards of fabric, or direct material. All right, and so we get $115,000, and it's negative, which you may recall means that our variance is favorable. All right. Now, well, before I take a moment to elaborate there, let's continue on with part D, which is the materials usage variance. All right, we can pull that from our formula sheet as well. All right, and again, it does give you the algebraic reduction. You don't necessarily need that. You can always work it that way, but we're going to take actual quantity minus standard quantity times standard price. All right, so we can plug in what we've got. All right, so as it relates to materials, the actual quantity used, well, we already know that. That was a part of the previous problem. So your 460,000. Standard. We need to compute this, right? Because 8 yards per unit over 55,000 coats. Right? And we just want the yard standard, not necessarily the $6. We don't need that right at this moment. All right? That gives us standard quantity, and then we'll multiply that by the standard price, and that's where the $6 comes into play. All right, and we get 120,000. That's showing positive, which we should interpret as an unfavorable variance. All right. Now, when we think of the two materials variances, the materials price variance, $115,000 favorable. Well, that makes sense, or it should make sense, because it's right in the problem. We paid $5.75 per yard, and the budgetary standard was 6. So over 460,000 yards, that works out to $115,000. All right. Now, we've got an unfavorable usage variance, all right, which can only mean that we used more than 8 yards, which is your standard. You used more than the standard 8 yards per coat, at least on average. All right. Now, the other thing I want you guys to be aware of is that all we've done is taken this variance and broken it out into useful pieces. You can't do a lot with the $5,000 direct materials variance. In fact, this is the worst kind of variance because you have an offsetting favorable variance for materials price and for materials usage. All right. And just as a proof, we'll offset these. All right, and I only did that to show that this $5,000 ties back to this, right? This is the same variance. We've just broken it out into the portion of the variance that's based on price. They got a much better price than the standard would indicate, but the company, Ross Company, used much more than 8 yards of fabric per coat, right? Now, this information obviously is more useful, right? Because if there's too much scrap being made per coat, that's where the controlling comes into play. With the price, maybe that's some indication that the budgetary standard was too high, all right? Or maybe market forces drove it down, but that's useful information for the next set of standards that will roll into the next year, all right? Let's keep going. We've still got parts E and F. All right, labor rate variance. So let's do that. All right, so we have the long form and then the algebraic reduction. So our labor rate variance is actual rate minus standard rate times actual hours. Just make sure I got that right. So let's plug in the actual rate given information 19.25 less the standard rate of 18 actual hours. Okay. Um, so let's run this formula. All right, so we get $150,000 there for the labor rate variance. Now, this relates to the differential, and this is it shows as a positive, which means this is an unfavorable variance. And the way all of this variance, 100% of this variance, can be explained by the fact that the budgetary standard indicate that labor would cost $18 an hour, and the actual cost of labor was $19.25. All right. So continuing on with part F. All right, we've got labor efficiency variance. All right, which we'll refer to our formula sheet. Actual hours minus standard hours times standard rate. All right, actual hours, 120,000 minus standard hours. So again, we need to compute that. Supposed to take 2 hours per coat. 55,000 of them were made. And your standard rate, given information, $18. Shows positive, so that's also unfavorable, right? Now this efficiency variance means that it took more than 2 hours of labor per coat, all right? So with the materials variances, we had offsetting variances. One was favorable and the other was unfavorable, and fairly substantial amounts, but they netted to an amount that you might have ignored if you didn't know that they were offsetting variances. In this case, we have variances going in the same direction. For labor, we have an unfavorable labor rate variance and an unfavorable labor efficiency variance. And if we've done this right, they aggregate to the 330,000 that we came to with a total budget variance. So again, 330,000. Perhaps that is big enough to merit attention and control or corrective action. Where do you start? Well, 150 of that deals with the rate. And, did the company overpay for labor, or was there market forces that made the budgetary standard less than feasible? Again, we don't have to answer that here, but that's a potential explanation that would start from this problem, right? And that's really what we're doing here. We're working through kind of the starting point to figure out what actions might be taken, all right? The next 180,000, all right, unfavorable efficiency variance, all right? It basically, that tells you it took more than 2 hours of labor to make each coat, right? And if you were so motivated, you could figure out exactly how much more. The problem doesn't ask that we do that, nor will I on an exam, so I'll spare you that. But you could figure out the actual time it took to make each coat. All right, is that indicative of a standard that was set with too tight a tolerance, or maybe there's something else going on? All right, for instance, in this particular problem, you might say that since the material's price variance was so favorable that the company purchased substandard quality input, fabric input, material input, and that resulted in more scrap. We see that with the usage variance, and more rework, and we see that with the efficiency variance. So that just might be an explanation here. But we've done what the problem asked of us. We've computed all the variances. And hopefully with this, you've seen that rate variances or price variances and our efficiency variances are really the starting point for corrective or controlling action. Okay, so there is a part 2 to this that you should be able to get through. Try your hand at this in addition to some of the homework problems in Cengage. I'll post solution to this later in the week. All right, till next time.